Hello friends and welcome back to my channel. My name is Katie and today we are doing another reading wrap-up type video. Today I'm going to run you through my top 10 favorite non-fiction reads that I read last year. I did also recently do a video about my top 10 favorite adult fiction books of 2021, and I will leave a link to that video in the description box below if you would like to watch that. I was pretty proud of myself for that video because I did manage to rank those books. So I went through them in order of favorites. I started with my 10th favorite adult fiction book of the year and went right up to my absolute favorite. I've tried to do the same with these non-fiction books, but I feel like it's a little bit harder. Obviously, I connect deeply with all of these books in some way. That is why they've made it to my top 10 favorites of the year. But a lot of them are very personal. They're about lived experiences. And so ranking them feels, I don't know, a bit trickier to me. So I've still tried to, but literally I wrote this list yesterday and right now I'm sort of wanting to rearrange it. So I'm still going to rank them in this video, but please know that this ranking is much less solid and certain. Take the rankings with a grain of salt, basically. I loved all of these books. Let's start with a fun one. This is 7 Kinds of People You Find in Bookshops by Sean Bithell. I know this author has written 1 or 2 other books. I haven't read them. This was my first introduction to this author. I picked this book up on a bit of a whim because it's quite a pretty little book. I work in a bookshop and I just thought it was fun. And that it was just a really fun, playful sort of read. It's a pretty short volume, so it didn't take me long to get through. And essentially it's structured into 3 different main types or categories of people that you will find in bookshops, according to this author. The author does run and own, I think, a secondhand bookshop and has done for many years. So this is sort of like just a fun exploration of his own experiences working and running a bookshop. He shares little anecdotes about experiences that he's had with different quirky customers, and he also goes into different like subsets of each of the categories and gets really quite specific, which I thought was just really funny. And I definitely, as I was reading through, there were certain customers that were like popping up in my mind that have come into the bookshops that I work at. So I think if you work in a bookshop or if you just really love bookshops, this is the sort of book that I think you'll just get a good chuckle out of. And this is the sort of book that I just had to hand around to all of my book selling friends. The next book I want to share with you is the Tarot Activity book. I do read tarot. I love tarot. I have a whole other tarot channel here on YouTube, in case you didn't know. And I don't read tarot books all that often anymore, but this one I really enjoyed. I have read it cover to cover, and I sort of flagged a bunch of the activities that I was interested in doing. And since I read it, I very often find myself picking this book up to go through and find an activity for me to do. This very much represents one of the main ways that I like to work with tarot. I love doing readings for myself for my own sort of like mental wellness and maintenance and just like psychological insight. And the other thing that I love to do with tarot is different kind of self-care therapeutic activities. I have a whole series on my other channel dedicated to just that, with activities that I have come up with. And so to have a book with like about 100 different activities that I can go through and get inspiration from, it's just really handy to have, and it's definitely become a core part of my practice. And even though engaging with tarot in this kind of way is something that I'm pretty familiar with, just the variety that is provided in this book did get me out of my comfort zone with quite a few of them and get me exploring it tarot in new ways, which is really exciting and all I can really hope for from a book like this. So it's definitely been, I mean, maybe while I was reading through it, it wasn't like, oh my God, this is my new favorite tarot book, but it has been the book that I keep going back to, and I'm really glad I discovered it in 2021. The next one I want to share with you is actually a graphic novel, but it is a memoir, so it is non-fiction. It fits into this category, and it's called Marbles, Mania, Depression, Michelangelo and Me, a graphic memoir by Ellen Forney. Now, this is a graphic novel all about the experience Ellen shares of sort of the early signs of mania, and then the experience of getting diagnosed with bipolar, and then going through quite a lengthy process of trying to get medicated and therapy with her psychiatrist. This is set in the 90s and early noughts from memory, and so elements of it do feel a little bit dated and jarring to me personally, but overall I just really appreciated the very candid, approach to this graphic memoir. Ellen is an artist. She was an artist long before she recognized symptoms of bipolar and started getting treated. And so a large part of this book is exploring that connection between creativity and mania, which is sort of like those two things have been sort of bound up in like pop culture and our ideas of different really prolific and creative people throughout history. And so I think the way that Ellen sort of explores what this means for her and tries to unpack the stigma, the assumptions, the romanticization, and find herself and her own truth within all of that. Even if I don't always agree with her particular language or even the conclusion she comes to, I think nuanced discussions of lived experience of complex mental illness and stigmatized mental illness there's often not a lot of space for that to happen. And so I think that's one of the reasons I really appreciated this memoir in particular. But I just really loved this. I really love the visual representations of mania and its symptoms, as well as depression, and just sort of like not only talking about what that felt like and what that did to her, but like literally seeing it in graphic novel, like in the imagery. It was really well done. It just felt very authentic and human. And I think that's a wonderful thing, to be able to share an authentic human experience in the midst of a very stigmatized, complex, misunderstood illness. I identified with many elements of it. I didn't with many others, but I really appreciated having this little book to read through. Next up is Emotional Female by Yumiko Kadota. This is an Australian book. I think it was released last year. It's a debut. Yumiko basically is a doctor here in Australia, and she was training to become a plastic surgeon. She was really passionate about that sort of like art form. She almost describes it as throughout the book. But basically Yumiko was like a qualified doctor, and she was training to become a plastic surgeon. And she got quite far through that process, but came up against a lot of hurdles and ultimately ended up burning out and having to give up on her dream. This book follows her through her childhood, growing up, and moving around from like Japan to England and then Australia. I think there might be one other country in there. We follow her whole journey basically, and it's really, really beautifully done. I loved learning about Yumiko's sort of like upbringing and her family, but then seeing how different elements of her identity really influenced her experience, whether it be in school, in university, or actually like in hospital situations as a doctor. In particular, the racism and the sexism that she experiences is just, it's horrific. It almost makes you feel like, I can't believe this is still happening, but like, of course it is. We all know it is, but it's just infuriating, and it's heartbreaking to sort of have to watch and read from the outside as this incredibly talented, brilliant, bright, passionate, empathetic young woman has to give up on her dream because of all of this external bullshit. And Yumiko, through this book and further writings online, has become really this big advocate for women in medicine in particular. She also talks a lot about how like the really toxic overwork culture, especially within plastic surgery and surgery in general, means that really good people who are perfect for this job end up getting pushed out. And more often than not, they are people with oppressed identities, like people of color and women. It's just a really well done book. Like, I don't have a particular interest in medicine or in plastic surgery or anything like that, but Yumiko really brings like the human element to the table first and foremost. And that is why I just found it so compelling. I blitzed through this so quickly. I laughed, I cried along with her. And I just think she's an incredibly powerful and important voice in Australia at the moment. And this was a wonderful book. Of course, I cannot have a year where I don't list a Maxine Beneba Clarke book as one of my favourites. And this year I read The Saturday Portraits by Maxine Beneba Clarke. Basically, this is a collection of portraits that Maxine wrote over the period of several years for the Saturday paper. This was basically like a column that Maxine contributed to the Saturday paper pretty regularly, where she would sort of, write like a creative non-fiction portrait of a public figure often, but not always. Some of them she interviews or has very close relationships with. Others she has like fleeting experiences of, or more writes about her experience of like the portrayal of them in media. But what I think is really cool about all of these, and especially the experience of reading these as a book, is that Maxine is very much like her own character in the stories. Like she's not trying to take an objective observer point of view where she removes herself from these portraits. Instead, her identity, her experience, her beliefs, her opinions form part of the narrative, form part of what makes these so compelling. And so that also ties the whole book together in a really beautiful way as well. Some of the people included in this book that Maxine has written portraits about are Tony Abbott, Jack Charles, Roxane Gay, Van T. Rudd, Hugh Jackman, Julian Assange. She did one on Black Lives Matter, and Melissa Lukashenko. This is another one that I just flew through. I found it so interesting learning about many public figures I already do know quite well, like Tony Abbott was one of our prime ministers quite recently, pretty big deal, and also learning about plenty of figures that I didn't know much or anything about at all. It was just fascinating, and I love Maxine's writing. She is one of my favorite authors, so I was very well poised to like something like this, and I did. I loved it. This one I don't have here to show you because I've lent it out. It is Quit Like a Woman, The Radical Choice to Not Drink in a Culture Obsessed with Alcohol by Holly Whitaker. I read this back in February, so apologies if my memory's a little bit shaky, but this book I found so impactful. For a bit of context, I am 8 years sober, I think. I haven't read a lot of sober lit, I think they call it. So I can't really compare it to too many other books in this category. I have read a book by Catherine Gray, I think it was, and I did really enjoy that, but it had a very different vibe. This book much more focuses on the culture of alcohol and the influence of big alcohol companies and like the money that is there to be made from alcohol on our political systems, on our culture, on our policies. And she essentially frames the decision not to drink, to be sober, as like this revolutionary, empowered act. And I really identified with that and I liked it a lot. She also challenged the notion of alcoholism. She doesn't outright say that like alcoholism doesn't exist, but the way that we talk about it and the way that we use that word is very influenced by Alcoholics Anonymous, which is inherently like a Christian idea. And Holly argues that pretty much all humans are not really designed to drink alcohol, that given enough time, enough alcohol, most people will become addicted to it in some way. Basically, it's not a flaw of a small percentage of the human population that they just aren't strong enough to handle alcohol. Rather, alcohol is not really good for us as humans. And I really identified with this conversation as well because I think it's so easy to dissociate from the problems alcohol can cause in our lives because, you know, we don't do certain things that we think an alcoholic would do. And in our culture, it's very much, it feels like often this sort of idea that you either do drink or you're an alcoholic and you can't drink, which makes it very difficult to have healthy, productive conversations around what a healthy relationship with alcohol actually really truly looks like. So I really identified with a lot of that. And then towards the end of the book, I think it was the second last chapter or something, I remember there was this really incredibly powerful chapter about intersectionality and how that is definitely an important addition into the conversation around sobriety and alcohol. And she essentially framed alcohol and addiction as a social justice issue, which I think is so important and not spoken enough about in like the sober lit sort of category of books. And that's one of the reasons I think I haven't been very much attracted to that kind of genre of books and content online. It helped me better understand my own journey with alcohol and sobriety and sort of some of the challenges I had, some of the resistance and pushback, a lot of the resistance and pushback I had from society, even people that I loved. And as I said, especially that like chapter towards the end about social justice and intersectionality when we're talking about this conversation was really awesome. This is Palestinian Walks by Raja Shahade. This is a book that I read with my book club over on the Blossom Book Club on my Patreon, and this was such an incredibly moving read. I actually ended up listening to the audiobook and reading the physical copy along at the same time, and I really enjoyed that. I feel like I found that very immersive. Basically, through this, we follow Raja as he takes several walks through the Palestinian hills, I think as early as the 1970s, and there's several walks through the decades. So in part, this book is a love letter to the hills of Palestine, and it's beautiful, it's evocative, and like just having him describe the environment and the landscape, it's just gorgeous, it's luscious. But as he's walking, he's also telling stories, and he's remembering or noticing like the changes on the landscape. In particular, the changes that are sort of being forced on him and his people through the settler colonialism of Israel. And the violence on both humans and land that he details through this book is just absolutely, it's heartbreaking. And yet the love that he has for this land and the passion that he has for his people and his culture and their architecture and their way of life is just, it's palpable. It's so tender, and ultimately this book is just one of the most beautiful and devastating books I've ever read. I'm so glad that I read it and that we read it together in the book club, because I think this is the sort of book that more people really need to read. It's such an accessible way to get a bit of insight into the experience of Palestinians. I think because there's that groundedness and that beauty that is being celebrated at the same time that we're learning about the history and the atrocities. It's just incredibly well done, and definitely one I highly recommend. Care Work, Dreaming of Disability Justice is another book that I don't have here to show you because I've lent it out. Because even though I wanted to reread it almost as soon as I'd finished, this is the kind of book that I just feel like more people need to read. Everyone needs to read this book. So when I had someone ask me if they could read it, I pushed it into their hands because I genuinely want more people to read this book. This honestly was one of the harder books for me to read this year, and it's another one that we read along with the Blossom Book Club. Thank you so much to everybody who participated in that this year. It's been an incredible journey. This is quite a short book, but it packs a punch. Boy, does it pack a punch. In this, Leah Lakshmi basically explores the intersections of disability, race, gender, sexuality, and many more. She talks so frankly and honestly about ableism and what that means for a disabled person and how people experience it in both like the really big overt ways and also in like those microaggressions of everyday experience. She also explores what community care can look like, what it does look like for different people, and what it really means. There's also a lot of discussion around like mental illness, suicide, sexual assault, and how the experience of sexual assault and PTSD also sort of needs to be incorporated into the world and understanding of disability justice. I love how she talks about disabled people as having their own unique science and skills and talents and knowledges. I've just found this so affirming and validating. I found it absolutely shattering and often quite triggering. I think it's one of those books, at least it was for me, that just really like cracked something open. Like I have long identified as someone with a disability. I have very often spoken about ableism on my channels, on Instagram, that sort of stuff. Like it's something that I care about and that I think about fairly often. But this book just sort of like, I don't know, it was radical, it was incredible, it was beautiful, it was strong, and it just, I don't know, it sort of like elevated the way that I think about these things, I suppose, and definitely encouraged a much more intersectional approach as well. I guess it's still in some ways hard for me to talk about this book. I feel like I was honestly just so emotionally raw while I was reading it. And I need to go back and read it again. Like that is honestly something I feel like I need to do for myself and for my community. Like this is a book that I don't think I got everything from, because my first read through was very much like an emotional experience of validation, of connection, but it was hugely powerful. And this is another one that I think more people need to read. The Anthropocene Reviewed by John Green. Now, I am a fan of John Green. I haven't read all of his books, but Turtles All the Way Down was a really powerful book for me. And I've watched the Green Brothers on like the Vlogbrothers channel for literally years. So like I am in no way an objective reviewer in this sense. I also haven't actually read this physical copy. I got an ALC, a advanced listeners copy from Libro FM when the book was first released, or just before it was first released. And I loved it so much I knew I needed to have it in physical copy. But I definitely recommend the audiobook if audiobooks are something that you enjoy and have access to. I think in large part because this did originally start out as a podcast, which I used to listen to. And so the audio element of it definitely, I think it works really well for the format and just the way that John has set up these essays. I love the way that he talks about chronic illness and mental illness and his experience of those things, and how it seems like he is almost always compelled to explore topics around consciousness, mortality, and humanity. Just in case you don't know, essentially the premise in this is that John reviews different elements of our human-centered planet on a 5-star scale, including the 5-star scale itself. And through each essay or review, he meanders and he talks about like the history of the thing, his own personal association or his own sort of like elements of connection to that thing. Like basically this is a memoir, but told through reviews of different parts of our human world. So it's a memoir. We learn about John and his life experience, but we also get like a history lesson on different very specific things, whether it be teddy bears or lawn grass or Canada geese. As you'd expect, John brings in his sense of humor, which often is a little bit on the darker side. And I don't know, I get the sense that John, and I very much identify with this, is someone who is more intrinsically a negative, but verging on hopeless kind of person. And yet he kind of, through obstinance, refuses to give up on hope. And I really identify with that, and I find his sort of exploration of that and his own consciousness, I find it really inspiring and affirming. And especially, as I said, his descriptions and the way that he tries to understand and explore with words his experience of mental illness, I find incredible. Basically, I felt like I got to learn so much about John, about history, about our world, and about myself. And I laughed out loud. I sobbed like a baby. I still get teary when I think about some of these these essays. I love this book. I know this is a book I will return to. And I know it's not really cool to like John Green anymore, but this is by far the best book he's ever written. It's incredible. This is The Roomie Prescription by Melody Moeasy. This is another book that we read along with the Blossom Book Club, and oh my God, was it incredible. We were also lucky enough to be able to have a live chat interview sort of session with Melody after we'd read it, which was really special. This is a memoir from Melody in which she talks about the process of recovering from an episode of illness with her bipolar disorder. And essentially in her journey of recovery, she connects with her father, who has a love of roomie, and they translate roomie together, and they sort of together learn so much about each other and roomie and their culture and their language. And all of this helps Melody heal and to become a more whole, happy version of herself. She also talks a lot about the experience of psychiatric hospital, of suicide, of loving people with complex mental illnesses, as well as racism and other social justice issues. Her writing is absolutely beautiful. Like, I would describe this as creative nonfiction. I don't know if that's accurate, but her writing is lyrical, it's beautiful, and I love how the mystical really gets incorporated into a very grounded discussion of mental illness. And I think that is perhaps the thing that I appreciated most about this book. The whole thing I found absolutely beautiful, totally moving. But I think what I respected and appreciated most about this book was the way Melody was able to be honest and true to her mystical experiences without romanticizing mental illness. Like, such balance and nuance is needed in order to convey that in a way that I think is healthy and responsible, I suppose is the right word. And I think conversations like this, where people with illnesses, and especially stigmatized illnesses, who have mystical experiences and religious experiences that are so important to them, are all too often dismissed because of their illness. Or, of course, we swing too far the other way and romanticize illnesses like bipolar and schizophrenia, which is equally as harmful. And just the way that Melody walked that fine line and expressed it with such authenticity, conviction, and truth was just, honestly, it was inspiring, and it was just gorgeous. This whole book was just it was tragic, it was sweet, it was honest, and ultimately heartwarming. I loved it. This is a new favorite book for me. Okay, so that wraps that up. Those are my top 10 favorite nonfiction books of 2021. I read some absolutely incredible books, and definitely some that I'm going to return to. A few of these I'm going to keep pushing onto other people because I think more people need to read them, especially Palestinian Walks, Care Work, and also Emotional Female. I think those are really important books for people to read. The others are also really important in their own ways, and I obviously connected really, really strongly with a lot of them on a really personal level. I would love to hear in the comments below what your favorite nonfiction reads of 2021 were, and I will talk to you in another video soon. Until then, so much love. Bye.